On my birthday, my husband revealed a family he'd kept secret for 30 years. I smiled and gave him a box. Elaine woke up before the alarm, the way she always did on days that mattered. The soft morning light slipped through the curtains and rested gently on the walls of the bedroom she had lived in for over 30 years. The room smelled faintly of clean sheets and lavender polish, familiar and comforting. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house, letting herself believe that this birthday would be like all the others, warm, calm, and full of small joys. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. She turned 62 that day. The number didn't frighten her. If anything, it felt earned. She had lived carefully, loved deeply, forgiven often, and learned when to stay silent. Those lessons had shaped her into the woman she was now, graceful not because life was easy, but because she had learned how to carry its weight without letting it show. Beside her, Richard shifted slightly in his sleep. He had been restless all night, tossing and turning more than usual. Elaine had noticed, of course. She noticed everything. After more than 3 decades of marriage, it was impossible not to. Still, she hadn't said a word. She never rushed to question things anymore. Time had taught her patience. She slipped out of bed quietly, smoothing the blanket behind her so it wouldn't wake him. As she walked into the hallway, the wooden floor creaked under her feet, just like it always had. She smiled faintly. Some things never changed, no matter how many birthdays passed. Downstairs, the kitchen waited for her, clean and orderly. Elaine liked mornings like this. Quiet ones. She filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then stood by the window while it warmed. Outside, the garden looked neat, trimmed carefully over the years. Richard used to take pride in it. Lately, though, he had been distracted, leaving small tasks unfinished. Elaine had taken care of them herself, the way she did with many things now. The kettle whistled, sharp and sudden. She poured the water slowly, letting the steam rise and fog her glasses. As she stirred her tea, her phone buzzed softly on the counter. A message from a cousin wishing her a happy birthday. Another from a neighbor, then one from an old friend she hadn't seen in years. Elaine smiled at each one, replying with short, warm words. She didn't need long conversations. The thought was enough. Richard came down about 20 minutes later, already dressed, his movements a little too quick. He smiled when he saw her, but the smile didn't fully reach his eyes. "Happy birthday," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. His hand lingered on her shoulder longer than usual. "Thank you," Elaine replied gently. He poured himself coffee, spilling a few drops on the counter. He wiped them up immediately, almost nervously. "You don't have to do anything today," he said. "I've got everything handled." Elaine raised an eyebrow slightly. That was unusual. She had handled birthdays in this house for years. Dinners, desserts, guest lists. It was usually her world. "I thought we were just having a small dinner," she said calmly. "Yes. Simple," Richard replied a little too fast. "Just family. A few friends." She nodded, not pressing further. She had already noticed the way he kept checking his phone, the way he stepped outside twice to take calls he said were about work. It wasn't lost on her. But she also knew that confronting him now would change nothing. Whatever was coming would come on its own. By the afternoon, the house slowly began to fill with familiar voices. Chairs scraped against the floor. Laughter echoed through the living room. Someone brought flowers, another brought a cake. Elaine moved through it all with practiced ease, thanking people, hugging relatives, listening more than she spoke. Everyone seemed happy, comfortable, proud, even. More than one person commented on how strong her marriage looked. 30+ years, a family friend said, raising a glass. That's something rare these days. Elaine smiled politely, lifting her glass in return. She felt Richard's eyes on her from across the room. He looked tense, adjusting his shirt collar, his fingers tapping lightly against his glass. As the evening approached, the mood shifted slightly. The energy grew sharper, tighter. Elaine noticed how Richard stood near the door more often now, glancing outside as if waiting for something, or someone. She noticed whispered conversations stopping abruptly when she entered a room. She noticed a distant relative she didn't recognize sitting quietly near the corner, avoiding her gaze. Still, Elaine said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence could be powerful. Silence gave people room to reveal themselves. Dinner was set beautifully. Candles flickered along the table, casting warm shadows on familiar faces. The smell of roasted food filled the air. Everyone took their seats, laughter settling into softer conversation. Richard cleared his throat. "I just want to say something before we eat," he said, standing up slightly. The room grew quiet. Elaine looked up at him, her expression calm, inviting. He smiled, but his hands trembled. "Elaine has been an incredible wife," he began. "A wonderful partner. A strong woman." People nodded. A few murmured agreement. "She deserves honesty," he continued. The word hung in the air longer than it should have. Elaine felt a small tightening in her chest, but her face remained unchanged. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and waited. Richard took a deep breath. "There's something I need to share with everyone tonight." No one spoke. The candles flickered harder, as if reacting to the tension. Elaine finally met his eyes. They held a mixture of guilt, fear, and something else, relief. And in that moment, she knew. Not the details. Not the full shape of it. But she knew that this birthday was never meant to be simple. It was meant to be a turning point. She smiled softly, the way she always did. And she waited for him to continue. Richard stood there for a moment longer than felt comfortable, his hand resting on the back of the chair. The room was so quiet that even the ticking clock on the wall sounded loud. Elaine could feel dozens of eyes shifting between her and her husband, waiting for something dramatic to happen. She stayed still, her face calm, her breathing steady. "I know this isn't how a birthday should go," Richard said, forcing a small laugh that no one returned. "But the truth doesn't wait for the right moment. It demands to be heard." He walked toward the front door. A few people exchanged confused looks. Someone whispered, "What's going on?" Another leaned forward in their chair, curiosity pulling them closer. Richard opened the door. The cold evening air rushed inside first, followed by three figures standing close together on the porch. A woman in her late 50s stepped in cautiously. Her hair was neatly pulled back, her coat modest, her eyes alert but tired. Behind her stood two young adults, a man and a woman, both in their 20s. They looked nervous, unsure where to stand, their hands clasped tightly in front of them. Gasps filled the room. Elaine's cousin covered her mouth. Someone dropped a fork. A chair scraped loudly as a guest stood halfway up before sitting back down again. Richard stepped aside and gestured them in. "Please," he said quietly. The woman hesitated, then walked inside. The two young adults followed, their eyes darting around the room, taking in the decorations, the guests, the birthday banner still hanging on the wall. None of them smiled. "This," Richard said, his voice shaking now, "is my family." The words landed like a stone thrown into still water. "What do you mean, your family?" someone asked. Richard swallowed. "I mean, my other family." The room exploded with noise, sharp breaths, whispers, questions spoken all at once. Elaine felt the tension rise like heat, pressing against her skin. Still, she did not move. "For 30 years, Richard continued, raising his hands slightly as if trying to calm the crowd, "I've supported them. Financially. Emotionally. I've been part of their lives." A stunned silence followed. Elaine slowly lifted her gaze to the woman standing near the door. Their eyes met briefly. The woman looked away first. "These are my children," Richard said, gesturing toward the two young adults. "My son and my daughter." Someone laughed softly, but it was a sound filled with disbelief, not humor. "This is a joke, right?" a guest said. "Some kind of surprise?" "No," Richard replied. This is real. Elaine could feel her heartbeat in her ears now, steady but strong. 30 years. The number echoed in her mind. 30 years of birthdays, holidays, quiet dinners, shared plans. 30 years of believing she knew the man sitting across from her. She noticed how everyone waited for her to speak, to cry, to scream, to throw something. She did none of those things. Instead, she stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her dress. The movement alone drew everyone's attention back to her. "Please," she said calmly. "Let them sit." Her voice was gentle, but firm. The room froze. Richard stared at her. The woman by the door looked shocked. The two young adults hesitated, then slowly moved toward the empty chairs near the end of the table. Elaine watched them carefully. They looked like strangers, yet there was something familiar in their faces. The tilt of the son's head. The daughter's thoughtful eyes. Details she had seen reflected in Richard over the years without ever questioning them. Once everyone was seated, Elaine returned to her place. "You've been supporting them?" she asked Richard quietly. "Yes," he said. "I never meant to hurt you." A few people scoffed. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." Elaine nodded once. "How long have they known about me?" The woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was low, careful. "We always knew you existed." The words stung more than Elaine expected. Not because of anger, but because of the calm way they were spoken. "And you agreed to this?" Elaine asked, looking directly at her. The woman hesitated. "I didn't feel I had a choice." Elaine considered that. Then she turned to the young adults. "And you?" The son cleared his throat. "We grew up knowing he was married. We didn't come here to cause trouble." The daughter nodded. "We just wanted the truth to stop being hidden." Elaine let out a slow breath. Around her, the room felt like it was holding its own breath too. Richard reached for Elaine's hand, but she gently pulled it away. "I need to understand something," she said. "You lived 2 lives. How did you manage that?" Richard looked down. Carefully. Too carefully. Elaine glanced around the room. At the guests who had celebrated her marriage just minutes ago. At the cake with candles still unlit. At the decorations that suddenly felt misplaced. "Everyone," she said softly, "please give us a moment." No one moved. She raised her voice just slightly. "Please." One by one, guests began to step away. Some whispered apologies. Others avoided eye contact. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty, leaving only Elaine, Richard, the woman, and the 2 young adults. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Elaine looked at Richard. "You planned this. On my birthday." "Yes," he said quietly. "I couldn't keep lying." "After 30 years," she replied. "You chose today." He nodded. "I thought honesty would be a gift." Elaine smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Honesty doesn't feel like a gift when it comes this late. She turned to the other woman. "What is your name?" The woman told her. Elaine nodded. "You've shared a life with my husband for decades." "Yes," the woman said. "In pieces." Elaine considered that phrase. In pieces. It described her own life more than she liked. She walked to the side table and picked up a small box wrapped neatly in silver paper. The same box she had planned to give Richard after dinner. "I had something prepared too," she said calmly. Richard looked confused. "Elaine." She held up a hand. "Not yet." She placed the box on the table in front of him. "I smiled all evening," she said. "Not because I didn't see the signs, but because I wanted to see how far you would go." Richard stared at the box but didn't touch it. Elaine straightened her shoulders. "You brought your truth tonight. I brought mine." The room felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing closer, as if they too were waiting for what would come next. And Elaine, still calm, still steady, waited for Richard to open the box. Elaine did not rush him. Richard sat with his hands folded, staring at the small silver box on the table as if it might speak for him. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The other woman sat stiffly, her back straight, her eyes lowered. The two young adults shifted in their seats, clearly unsure if they should even be there. Finally, Richard took a breath. "It started on a business trip," he said quietly. "A long time ago." Elaine nodded once, giving him permission to continue. "I was sent out of town for 3 weeks," he went on. "Different city. Different routine. I felt invisible there. No one knew me as a husband, or as someone with responsibilities. I told myself it was temporary. Just a distraction." He paused, swallowing hard. "I met her at a small place near the hotel. We talked. Nothing deep. Just easy. I didn't tell her I was married at first." The woman flinched slightly but said nothing. Elaine's mind drifted back to that year. She remembered the trip. She had been busy repainting the guest room then. Richard had sounded tired on the phone, distant but kind. She had blamed stress. She always did. "When I came home," Richard said, "I told myself it was over. But it wasn't. I kept calling, visiting, making excuses." "How long before you told her the truth?" Elaine asked calmly. Richard hesitated. "Months." The woman spoke softly, her voice tight. "He said he was unhappy, that he felt trapped, that he would leave one day." Elaine turned to look at her fully now. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, steady attention. "And did you believe him?" Elaine asked. The woman's lips trembled. "At first, yes." Richard rubbed his face with his hands. "I told myself I could manage both lives. That no one had to get hurt." The son let out a short, sharp laugh. "That's not how it felt growing up." Richard looked at him. "I know." Elaine listened as the story unfolded, piece by piece. Holidays split in half. Excuses about work trips that were really birthdays, school events, hospital visits. Money quietly moved from one account to another. Lies stacked carefully on top of each other, balanced just well enough to stay standing. "I missed anniversaries," Elaine said slowly. "You always said it was deadlines." Richard nodded. "Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. I remember you leaving early on Christmas mornings," she continued. "You said your manager needed reports." Richard closed his eyes. "I went to see them." The daughter crossed her arms defensively. "He was there for us too." Elaine looked at her, studying her face. "I'm sure he was." There was no accusation in her tone, just truth. As Richard spoke, Elaine felt memories shifting inside her, like furniture being moved in a dark room. Moments that once felt random now lined up neatly. The late nights. The emotional distance that came and went without explanation. The sudden guilt-driven kindness after unexplained absences. None of it felt imaginary anymore. "I used to think I was asking for too much," Elaine said quietly. "That maybe marriage just became smaller with time." Richard's shoulders sagged. The woman finally lifted her eyes. They were wet with tears. "I didn't plan to stay," she said. "But then the children came. And life just happened." Elaine nodded. "Life does that." The son leaned forward. "We didn't ask for this," he said. "We didn't choose to be a secret." "I know," Elaine replied gently. The daughter's voice sharpened. "You don't know what it was like. Watching him leave. Watching him lie to you and then come back to us like nothing happened." Elaine met her gaze, unflinching. "You're right. I don't know that pain." She paused, then added softly, "But I know the pain of loving someone who wasn't fully there." The room fell quiet again. Richard looked at Elaine, his eyes full now. "I thought I was protecting you." Elaine let out a slow breath. "You were protecting yourself." He didn't argue. She thought of all the times she had defended him to friends. All the time she had lowered her expectations, telling herself that loyalty meant patience, that love meant endurance. "I rearranged my life around your absence," she said. "I just didn't know it had a name." Richard reached for the silver box at last, but Elaine placed her hand over it, stopping him. "Not yet," she said calmly. She stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the dark garden. The same garden she had cared for alone more times than she could count. "When did you decide to tell me?" she asked without turning around. Richard answered quietly. "When the children asked to stop being hidden." Elaine nodded. "So even now, it wasn't for me." That truth settled heavily between them. She turned back to face them all. "You've lived 2 lives for 30 years, she said to Richard. But tonight, they finally met. The woman lowered her head. The children looked away. Elaine returned to her seat, her movements steady. "I need time," she said. "Not to scream. Not to break things. Just to understand what my life actually was." Richard nodded quickly. "Take all the time you need." Elaine looked at him, her eyes clear and focused. "Time is the one thing you took without asking." No one spoke. Elaine glanced once more at the box on the table, then folded her hands in her lap. "And when you open that box," she said softly, "you'll understand why I stayed so calm." The air felt heavy again, waiting. And Elaine, having listened to every word, sat quietly as her marriage finally revealed its true shape. Elaine rose from her chair slowly, not as someone reacting, but as someone stepping into a moment she had already accepted. Her movement drew every eye back to her. Richard looked tense, almost bracing himself, as if expecting a storm that never came. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Elaine said gently. "I know this isn't what anyone expected." Her voice was steady, warm, even. The woman near the end of the table looked confused. The 2 young adults exchanged uneasy glances. Richard frowned slightly, as though he couldn't understand why Elaine wasn't raising her voice. "Please," Elaine continued, gesturing toward the chairs. "Sit down. There's no need to stand." No one moved at first. "I mean it," she said softly. "Sit." Slowly, everyone obeyed. Chairs scraped the floor again, but this time the sound felt heavier, filled with uncertainty. Richard remained standing for a second longer, then sat as well, his hands clenched together. Elaine stayed standing. "I won't shout," she said calmly. "And I won't insult anyone. That wouldn't help." Richard's eyes searched her face. "Elaine, you don't have to do this." "I do," she replied. "For myself." She walked a few steps forward, stopping near the center of the room. "You see," she said, looking around at them all, "anger takes energy. And I spent that energy years ago." The words landed quietly but firmly. The other woman looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Elaine turned toward her. "I mean that this isn't new to me." Richard's head snapped up. "What?" "I've known," Elaine said simply. "For years." The room went silent in a different way this time. Not shocked noise. Not gasps. Just stillness. "You knew?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elaine nodded. "Yes." The daughter leaned forward. "How?" Elaine smiled faintly. "Not all at once. Truth doesn't usually arrive loudly. It comes in pieces." She took a breath, then began, her voice even, almost reflective. "The first thing was the bank statement," she said. "Years ago. A small transfer that didn't match any bill. Not enough to question. Just enough to notice." Richard swallowed. "I told myself it was a mistake," Elaine continued. "I always did that. It made life easier." She paced slowly, as if walking through memories rather than the room. Then there were the phone records. Long calls at odd hours. Numbers saved under false names. "I didn't confront you. I watched instead." Richard shook his head slightly. Why didn't you say anything? Elaine stopped walking and looked at him directly. Because I wasn't ready to hear the answer. The other woman's hands trembled in her lap. There were absences too, Elaine said. Trips that didn't line up. Holidays you left early. Times when your stories didn't match the calendar. She paused, her eyes softening slightly. At first, I thought it was me. That I wasn't enough. That marriage just fades. The son frowned. So you just stayed quiet. Elaine looked at him. Silence isn't weakness, she said gently. Sometimes it's strategy. Richard leaned forward now. You let me live this lie? Elaine tilted her head. You lived it whether I spoke or not. She returned to her chair but didn't sit. Instead, she rested her hands on the back of it. I spent years gathering small truths, she said. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted clarity. The room felt smaller, tighter. Even the air seemed to listen. I watched how you behaved, Elaine continued. The guilt gifts. The sudden kindness after long absences. The way you avoided certain conversations. Richard looked down at the table. And then one day, Elaine said, I realized something important. She paused. I wasn't powerless. The other woman let out a quiet breath. I had choices, Elaine went on. I could leave. I could confront you. I could pretend forever. She smiled faintly. Instead, I waited. For what? Richard asked. For the truth to arrive without me dragging it in, Elaine replied. She reached toward the silver box on the table but didn't open it yet. I wanted to see if you would ever choose honesty on your own, she said. And if you did, when? The daughter's voice wavered. You planned this. Elaine shook her head slightly. Not the pain. Just the moment. She glanced around the room again. I prepared myself. Quietly. Legally. Emotionally. Richard looked up sharply. Legally. Elaine met his gaze. Yes. His face drained of color. I learned how to protect myself, she said calmly. How to separate finances. How to document patterns. How to stand on my own if I needed to. The other woman pressed her lips together, shame clear on her face. I didn't know you knew. Elaine nodded. I know. The son spoke again, defensive but uncertain. So you just watched us grow up from a distance? Elaine's expression softened. No. I watched your father disappear and return. I didn't know your faces then. Only the space you filled. She took a seat at last, folding her hands in her lap. I stayed, Elaine said, because I needed to be sure of who I was before everything broke. Richard's voice cracked. You should have told me. Elaine looked at him steadily. You should have told me. That silence felt final. Elaine turned to the other woman. I don't blame you alone, she said. This was built on shared silence. The woman nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. And you, Elaine said to the young adults, didn't ask to be born into secrecy. The daughter looked away, conflicted. I waited for this moment, Elaine continued, not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I wanted to speak without shaking. Richard stared at her, unsettled. You're too calm. Elaine smiled slightly. That's because I already grieved the marriage I thought I had. She glanced at the decorations, the candles, the uncut cake. Tonight, she said softly, isn't the end of something sudden. It's the end of something long. She slid the silver box a little closer to Richard. And now, she added, you can open this. Richard hesitated, his hands trembling more than before. Elaine leaned back in her chair, her face composed, her eyes clear. For the first time that night, Richard looked afraid. Not shouting. Not of anger. But of a woman who had seen the truth years ago, and waited until it could no longer be ignored. Elaine stood without rushing, the same way she had done all evening. There was no drama in the movement, no pause meant to draw attention. She simply rose, walked to the side table, and picked up the small box that had been waiting there since before dinner. The silver paper was smooth, the edges sharp and neat. She had wrapped it days earlier, hands steady, breath calm. At the time, she had wondered if she would feel anything when she finally gave it to him. Fear. Sadness. Relief. What she felt now was clarity. She walked back to the table and stopped in front of Richard. Everyone was watching again, but this time the curiosity felt different. He could feel it too. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. "This is for you," Elaine said, holding the box out to him. Richard stared at it as if it might burn him. "What is it?" "My birthday gift," she replied softly. Slowly, he reached out and took it. His fingers brushed hers for just a second. She felt nothing. "Go ahead," she said. "Open it." He hesitated, then began to peel back the wrapping. The sound of paper tearing seemed louder than it should have been. When the lid lifted, he frowned. Inside were neatly stacked papers. No jewelry. No sentimental note. Just documents, arranged carefully, clipped together. He pulled the first one out. His face changed almost immediately. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. "Financial records," Elaine said calmly. "Copies. Not originals." Richard flipped through the pages quickly. Bank statements. Account summaries. Transfers highlighted in neat pen marks. Dates. Amounts. "You went through my accounts," he said, his voice rising. "Our accounts," Elaine corrected. "And the ones you didn't think I knew about." The room felt tight again. The other woman leaned forward slightly, recognition slowly spreading across her face. Richard pulled out another document. Then another. Legal letters. Asset breakdowns. Property records. His breathing grew shallow. These are prepared," he said. "When did you do this?" Elaine folded her hands. "Years ago." Slowly. Carefully. The daughter's eyes widened. "You planned all this?" Elaine looked at her gently. "I prepared. There's a difference." Richard reached the bottom of the box. His hands stopped. The final document sat alone. Clean. Official. Signed. He stared at it for a long moment before reading the title. Divorce Agreement. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. You already filed," he whispered. "No," Elaine said. "I finalized." The word hit harder than shouting ever could. Richard's hands began to shake. "This isn't real." Elaine met his gaze. "It is." He flipped through the agreement desperately, scanning pages he didn't remember signing. "You didn't sign this," he said. "I would remember." Elaine nodded. "You didn't need to." His head snapped up. "What does that mean?" "It means," she said evenly, "that I followed the law. The same one that applies when trust is broken and assets are at risk." The other woman let out a quiet gasp. Richard pushed his chair back slightly. "You did this behind my back." Elaine tilted her head. "Like you did." He had no answer. She continued, her voice steady and clear. "I protected what was mine. What I earned. What I built. I separated accounts. Secured property. Ensured I could stand on my own." The son spoke sharply. "So this was all a trap?" Elaine looked at him calmly. "No. A safety net." Richard ran a hand through his hair. "You let me think I was in control." Elaine smiled faintly. "You were never in control. You were just uninterrupted." Silence followed. Elaine stood again, not to confront, but to explain. "I didn't want revenge," she said. "I wanted peace. And peace requires preparation." She looked at the other woman. "I never came to you. Never warned you. Never demanded anything. The woman nodded slowly, tears filling her eyes. I see that now. Elaine turned back to Richard. I waited until you chose honesty yourself. Because then, nothing could be twisted. Richard's voice broke. You planned to leave. Yes, Elaine replied simply. When? He asked. Elaine thought for a moment. The day I stopped asking myself what I did wrong. He slumped back into his chair. Elaine continued, not unkindly. I made sure I wouldn't depend on your guilt, or your promises, or your apologies. She glanced at the documents still spread across the table. Everything you see there exists, so I don't have to argue. Richard swallowed hard. What happens now? Elaine didn't hesitate. I leave with my dignity. You continue with the life you chose. The daughter looked confused. That's it. Elaine nodded. That's enough. Richard looked around the room, as if searching for someone to save him. No one spoke. You never loved me again after you found out, he said quietly. Elaine shook her head. I did. For a while. But love without honesty slowly turns into habit. And habit isn't enough to stay. She reached out and gently closed the box, sliding it back toward him. You brought your truth tonight, she said. I brought my freedom. Richard stared at the box, his hands resting uselessly on the table. For the first time, he understood what he had lost. Not just a wife, but the version of himself who believed he could control two lives forever. Elaine picked up her coat and bag, movements calm, deliberate. She paused at the doorway and looked back once. I hope, she said softly, that one day you understand that silence doesn't mean ignorance. Sometimes it means preparation. Then she turned and walked out, leaving the room heavy with realization, the box still unopened in spirit, even though its truth had already done its work. The door closed quietly behind her. And for the first time in decades, Elaine stepped into a life that belonged only to her. Elaine did not rush away after opening the door. She stepped just outside, then paused, as if remembering something important. Slowly, she turned back toward the room. Everyone inside looked startled, almost relieved, as though they had been holding their breath and hadn't realized it. There's one more thing, she said calmly. Richard looked up at her immediately, hope flashing in his eyes for a brief, foolish second. Elaine walked back in and placed her bag down gently on the chair. Her posture was relaxed, but her presence filled the room in a way it never had before. Not loud. Not forceful. Just certain. I won't argue, she said. I won't answer the same questions twice. But clarity matters. She looked at Richard first. The house, she said plainly, is in my name. Richard blinked. What? It has been for years, Elaine continued. Refinanced quietly. Paid down with documented income. Legally protected. Richard shook his head. That's not possible. It is, Elaine replied. And it's done. The other woman straightened in her chair, alarm spreading across her face. The savings accounts, Elaine went on, were separated a long time ago. Anything joint was documented and divided legally under advisement. Richard pushed his chair back slightly. Elaine, please. She raised a hand, stopping him without even looking at him. The investments, she continued, are also secured. Retirement. Long-term accounts. All protected. The son stood abruptly. So what does that mean? Elaine turned toward him. Her voice softened slightly, but her words did not. It means the future your father promised you, she said, was built on money that was never fully his to give. The room went silent again. The other woman's face drained of color. He told us everything was taken care of. Richard stood up now, panic rising. I was going to fix it. I still can. Elaine looked at him steadily. You can't fix what no longer belongs to you. The daughter crossed her arms tightly. So all those plans. Elaine nodded. They were never guaranteed. The woman let out a shaky breath. You knew this would hurt us. Elaine met her eyes. I knew the truth would hurt everyone. Lies just delayed it. Richard stepped toward Elaine. Please, he said, his voice breaking. We can talk about this privately. Elaine shook her head gently. We've talked enough in silence. One by one, guests began to move. Someone cleared their throat awkwardly. Another picked up a coat without meeting anyone's eyes. Chairs scraped softly as people made quiet exits, embarrassed, shaken, unsure what to say. I'm sorry, a relative murmured to Elaine as they passed her. Elaine nodded politely. Within minutes, the room felt emptier. Not just physically, but emotionally. The noise, the witnesses, the illusion of normalcy, all gone. Richard looked around desperately. Everyone's leaving. Yes, Elaine said. They came for a celebration. Not a confession. The other woman stood slowly. I didn't know he couldn't support us. Elaine nodded once. I believe that. Richard turned to her sharply. I did my best. Elaine's gaze hardened slightly. You did what was easiest. The son spoke again, anger mixed with fear. So what happens to us now? Elaine considered him carefully. You move forward with the truth. All of it. The daughter's voice trembled. He said he'd always be there. Elaine's voice was calm but honest. Being present and being dependable are not the same thing. Richard rubbed his temples. Elaine, please. I've lost everything. Elaine looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time that night without the weight of marriage pressing between them. No, she said quietly. You lost control. He flinched. You still have choices, she continued. Just not the ones built on deception. He reached for her hand again, desperation clear now. Don't do this. Elaine stepped back. I already did. She picked up her bag and coat once more. I won't argue, she repeated. I won't beg. And I won't negotiate my peace. The other woman wiped her eyes. I wish I'd known sooner. Elaine nodded. So do I. Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. Was any of it real? Elaine paused at the doorway. She didn't turn around right away. Yes, she said finally. But real doesn't always mean honest. She opened the door. Behind her, Richard stood alone in the center of the room. No guests. No support. No certainty. The power he thought he held for decades had vanished quietly, the same way it had been built. Elaine stepped outside and closed the door behind her without a sound. This time, she didn't look back. The house was quiet again. Not the tense silence of earlier, not the kind filled with unspoken words and waiting eyes, but a softer quiet. The kind that settles in gently, like dust after a long storm. Elaine stood in the living room for a moment, listening to it. The clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a car passed and disappeared down the street. She took off her coat and placed it neatly on the chair. The decorations were still there. A banner on the wall. A few balloons tied loosely, beginning to lose their shape. The cake sat untouched on the table, candles still unlit. It looked strange now, like a scene left behind after everyone had forgotten their lines. Elaine walked slowly through the room, not avoiding anything. She had learned that avoiding pain only made it louder later. She picked up a glass someone had left behind and carried it to the kitchen. Then another. She moved calmly, methodically, as if cleaning up after a normal gathering. In a way, she was. When everything was in its place, she sat down at the dining table and reached for the small stack of birthday cards that had been pushed aside earlier. They were colorful, some handwritten, some simple and store-bought. She opened the first one slowly. Warm words. A shared memory. A reminder of years past. She smiled faintly. The next card made her laugh quietly. A joke about age. Another about wisdom. None of them knew what this birthday had truly been. And that was fine. Not every truth needed an audience. As she opened each card, she felt the weight in her chest shift. Not disappear, but settle into something manageable. Hurt was still there. It would be for a while. She wasn't pretending otherwise. But beneath it was something new. Space. For decades, her life had been shaped around someone else's absence. Around questions she never asked out loud. Around excuses she accepted because they were easier than the truth. Now there was space where those things used to be. Elaine leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about all the nights she had gone to bed alone while telling herself it was temporary. All the mornings she had woken up early just to feel useful. All the time she had lowered her expectations and called it love. She didn't feel foolish. She felt human. Patience, she realized, had saved her. Not the kind that waits blindly, but the kind that watches and learns. The kind that prepares quietly while others assume nothing is happening. She stood and walked through the house one last time that night. Each room felt different now. Not empty. Honest. In the bedroom, she changed into comfortable clothes and sat on the edge of the bed. The other side was untouched. She didn't rush to fill the space. She let it be what it was. Alone didn't feel like failure anymore. It felt like peace. She thought of the younger version of herself, the woman who had believed that love meant endurance at all costs. She wished she could tell her that dignity mattered too. That self-respect wasn't loud or dramatic. That sometimes the strongest choice was to wait until you were ready to walk away without breaking yourself. Elaine turned off the light and lay down. Sleep didn't come immediately, but that was okay. Her mind was busy, sorting through the past and gently placing it where it belonged. Not erased. Just no longer in control. Tomorrow would come. And the day after that. And slowly, she would build a life that didn't require explanation or permission. As the house settled around her, Elaine smiled into the darkness. She had chosen dignity over drama, patience over rage. And in doing so, she had discovered something powerful. Real strength doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand to be seen. It waits.